When big business, big labor, and big government get in the room together, one can get quite concerned about things like concentration risk, those businesses and politicians and bureaucrats setting up barriers in terms of policy, legislation, etc., to competition. It's one thing to have those different voices in the room when they actually do disagree with and compete with each other and hold each other accountable. But when they start to sing from the same hymn sheets, I think the South African economy and many small and medium businesses should be rightly concerned. Now, the context behind this introduction is in the last few weeks, we've seen a few examples of larger businesses and industry bodies possibly papering over the cracks or trying to soothe concerns around government policy. Here we talk about things like expropriation without compensation, the Expropriation Act specifically, as well as possible changes to ICT sector regulations that would allow for more competition and for foreign investment from companies possibly such as Starlink. Now, joining me to discuss all of this, one person who has been in the room, as it were, in some of these discussions where the sausage is made, if we can put it that way, is the head of strategic communications at the Institute of Race Relations, Mr. Hermann Pretorius. Hermann, thanks very much for your time once again. We're doing back-to-back CRA discussions with you over the last 2 weeks, so we greatly appreciate your time, your analysis. I think before we get to your recent experience, especially with agribusiness and the agricultural side of things and the Expropriation Act, I just wanted to go a bit further back and focus on the mining charter, where one had years ago now, if one can believe it, you had a piece of legislation that was ostensibly supposed to, have these quote unquote noble intentions, and you had big businesses largely trying to assuage people's concerns and say everything will be okay, mineral rights will be secure, this won't have a negative effect on mining or on sort of linked and related industries and sectors. Everything will be hunky-dory. And as they say, the proof of the pudding is in the eating, and we've seen the effects of the mining charter specifically on South Africa's mining sector and on economic competitiveness. So if you could start us off just on that point, so we look back a bit, and then we'll get to the most recent developments in this broad topic of big business and big government working together in some ways.
Quite right. I think it was the former CEO of the Institute, the late great John Kane Berman, who made the point that South African big corporates has never met a government it doesn't like. That applied to, I think, pre-1994, and I think it certainly applies since then, where we could take the example of ABSA. ABSA might want to forget that it was once Volkskas and to have been a member of the National Party was to be a client of Volkskas. And as the change came, Volkskas adapted and, of course, became ABSA. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with that. If you're going to be a big sector player, of course, having sensible relationships with those in power is a corporate necessity. I think you'd be acting against the interests of your shareholders where you not try to pursue something like that. But with the mining charter, things became a bit more blatant, where we had South Africa as a historically wealthy source of minerals and precious metals, with really essentially the country's economic origin lying in the discovery of gold in the Witwatersrand. And for much of the 20th century, South Africa was the biggest or among the biggest gold mining sources across the world. However, with any industry that relies on exhaustible resources, at some point, of course, the cost of production does come into it. Can you still justify the methods of mining from 50 years ago or 100 years ago based on sources found at that time? Now, in a healthy economy, what then happens is technological innovation. And we see this, I think, particularly in Australia, where mining essentially gets a second life with the ability to either develop new technologies to reach veins of minerals or metals that previously were inaccessible. So you've got technological advancement so that you can go deeper or further than you've been before. Or you get sort of this recycling technological advancement where the materials rejected traditionally in a specific mining endeavor can be rehabilitated, reused, or even remined for a purer form of this or a missed form of that. So in a mining situation, the biggest component you have in your economic advantage beyond natural resources is flexibility to innovate technologically. That's the difference between a successful mining company and an unsuccessful one, if we accept that all other things being equal in terms of natural resources. However, if we look at the mining sector today, South Africa's mining sector is a shadow of its former self. And we have to ask ourselves why. And I think a big role as to, in the drama of what led to this why, must be the mining charter, which was essentially, the Americans call it DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. We call it, employment equity, affirmative action, whatever you want to call it. It was the demographic re-engineering of the South African mining sector, not to pursue technological innovation, but to pursue demographic representativity for political ends rather than economic ends. And the story of the mining charter actually takes a few years to come to its fruition. And we can trace the behavior of corporate South Africa from being initially opposed to this sort of imposition, to thinking, no, perhaps we can get a seat at the table and make our voice more robust, make the sector's interests more heard, to a bit of a sellout in terms of, no, we see this as a policy that could be damaging, but at least we've got a seat at the table that can mitigate some of the disasters. And we end up in a situation like we are today, where South Africa's mining sector is struggling to be competitive. We've seen over the last decade massive mining interests actually leave South Africa. And we have to ask why. And that is because the focus of innovation, the resources that should have gone on innovation, were simply diluted through various things like BEE or employment equity targets. And all of this done with the biggest mining players having a quote unquote seat at the table. And if that was an isolated story, you could tell it as a corporate horror story and it would be sort of eyebrow raising. The thing is, it's not really. What it is, it's a bit of a portent of things to come. And we can unpack this in various ways. Personally, I think I've experienced the same sort of corporate mindset, going from opposition to robust engagement to damage control engagement to essentially almost a selling out use of regulation to limit the scope for competition within the sector. I think we've seen traces of it in the financial sector, particularly when it comes to the prescribed assets policy that has come and gone and has started coming again to the surface in recent years. We can see it, I think, in NHI, where the behavior of big sector players like Discovery and Dis-Chem really only became oppositional when it became clear that years of corporate engagement with the government resulted in the NHI remaining a terribly ideological thing. And I think we can see it in the employment equity compliance mob. And I think we can see it in big agri and probably in many other sectors as well. But there's a pattern of behavior of corporate South Africa assuming wrongly that an ideological government is there to be negotiated with in the best interests of that sector. And quite often that morphs into what in West Germany became one of the greatest threats to the free market, was essentially this triangle of big government, big labor, and big business working together, not to ensure mutual collaboration for the betterment of the economy, but to ensure mutual protectionism with the consumer's experience, the consumer's burden, the consumer's cost of living actually a second order priority. And my fear is that in South Africa, we have the ingredients for a very, very similar stitch up across the board.
Hermann, if we can drill down a bit from what you've highlighted now, sort of the timeline, into your most recent experience in this particular area, as it were. So a few weeks ago, you attended the latest gathering iteration of NAMPU, the biggest agricultural event show in the Southern Hemisphere. There you participated in a panel discussion with, amongst others, Dean McPherson, the Minister of Public Works, as well as representatives of agricultural sector bodies and organizations. Part of that discussion / debate was you pushing back, I think strongly and rightly, on attempts to assuage concerns around the Expropriation Act. Can you tell us a little bit just about that, and why you thought right now is, exactly the right time to highlight these issues? You did write about this in more detail on the Daily Friend, and we will link to that article of yours in the description below. Just before you answer, I just want to quote from your article where you say, "Secure title is the bedrock of competitive farming. It makes land bankable, unlocks credit, allows family farms to continue, and gives newcomers a chance to compete. Remove that foundation and capital dries up. Markets consolidate around a handful of giants. Smaller producers are suffocated. Yet, given the opportunity to point out the gross failures of the Act, AgriSA and AgBiz, bodies meant to defend the entire agricultural sector, particularly its most vulnerable members, simply chose not to." End quote. So why do you think possibly they chose not to?
So in a healthy agricultural economy, land is collateral. Secure title is collateral. It's the ability to put the asset you have against the possibility of making a successful economic contribution, or the risk of not doing so in terms of, the harvest year ahead. However, I spoke to a farmer with a background in policy analysis who said to me, if you look carefully over the last decade, perhaps a bit more, there's been a shift from financing agribusiness with land as collateral to financing agribusiness with things like cash flow as collateral, so that you can actually say, I've got cash on hand, or I've got cash flow that is healthy enough for a bank to give me credit so that I can take the risk for the coming year. Now, the problem with that is, for that model of financing to work, it works only for those with those type of resources, those types of assets that can act as collateral. If you are a family farmer or a small farmer or an emerging farmer, you simply don't have those resources. And once you understand the economic reality that it favors the big players who have those resources to devalue land as an asset, leading to the suffocation of smaller producers and competition, and you weigh that against what Dan Crick, the former president of AgriSA, said in 2019, I think, might have been 2018, when he said that if the 20% of farmers who produce 80% of the food in South Africa can be protected against EWC, more progress can be made with the policy. That was a very revealing comment, saying that what matters to, at that time, AgriSA, and as I say in the piece, I haven't seen evidence of that attitude changing. At that revealed what the AgriSA interest really is when it comes to expropriation without compensation, is not a principled defense of property rights, but rather a defense of certain actors' property rights within the business. And what made me even more suspicious is that when I was on the stage at NAMPO, Theo Boshoff of AgBiz, towards the end of the discussion, said that this act is manageable. And I thought that is an extraordinary thing to say, because what does that mean? What does a hostile attack on property rights mean if it is manageable? Well, it can only mean that you can perhaps negotiate carve-outs, or specific defenses. Because if something is manageable, that means you accept its premise, but you think you can mitigate its negative consequences. I mean, if I'm wrong in assuming that's what manageable means, I'm not sure what manageable means other than that. So we had Dan Crick say that, we had Tube Borsov say something like that, and Tube Borsov also wrote in a piece on Agbiz's website earlier this year, shortly after the signing of the act, or at least shortly after it became public, that expropriation without compensation was an academic abstraction. Now, I don't know much about academic abstractions, but I wonder why a parliament would pass law, a president would sign law for the purpose of academic abstraction. I don't think you can credibly make the case that states create for themselves awesome powers for the sake of academic abstraction. Why have expropriation below market value compensation in the act if it was just an economic abstraction? Then we also had Annelies Crosby of Agbiz, their head of legal intelligence, also say that actually this is just a procedural act. This is sort of an update to the 1975 Act. So you've got these corporate voices. You've got Wandile Sihlobo, Agbiz's economist, who is a very likable and knowledgeable guy, worth listening to when it comes to agricultural economics, if not agricultural law. You get these people consistently downplaying the risk of the Expropriation Act. You get the same with Willem de Chavon-Vrucht, who was the Agri-SA representative at NAMPO. And the only conclusion you can really draw is that either these people are economically willing to shoot their own sector in the foot, or they are shooting at something else in the sector. And that is similar of the mining charter. It is similar to this idea that you can use a regulatory change in law or a parliamentary change in law to make it more difficult for people to compete with you in your share of the economy and minimize your market share. It is worrying, it is sinister, but what it cannot be is deniable. This is a pattern of behavior that has simply become too common when big business interests think they sit at the table with enough influence to make the right calls. Invariably, it seems to morph into this type of anti-competitive, big guy sells out little guy scenario that you sort of alluded to in your introduction.
Hermann, as we start to wrap up, a last point that I and we would like and need your analysis on, and this latest example of what we've been talking about now in broader strokes, a broader theme. We talk about these possible amendments to ICT sector regulations, where you can possibly introduce employment equity equivalent programs that could in some way provide alternatives to what we've seen up until this point in time. Now, this has all come to a head just after President Ramaphosa and his delegation met with President Trump in the White House, and you had one of the discussion points, I think it was at first brought up in that forum, at least by businessman Johan Rupert, when he talked about the need for Starlink in South Africa. And that will be the focus. The perception will be this is why these amendments are now being proposed to benefit one company. I think there is already and there will be strong pushback from larger telecoms companies in South Africa, and possibly motivated by what we've touched on. So protecting oneself from competition. So if you can be in the room when amendments are made, if those amendments are made, at least make sure that you push back wherever possible to ensure that you're still protected to some extent. I link this just broadly to the program of BEE itself, where just this past week we had Professor William Gumede. He said he calculated the amount of money which has been moved through empowerment in South Africa. Quote, conservatively, 1 trillion rand has been moved between under 100 people since 1994. The same people have been empowered and re-empowered over and over. South Africa's BEE model has created a model of corruption because people set up companies just to get a contract, end quote. I mean, if you want to summarize the effect of such a program, not its intentions, not its spirit, the actual effect on South Africa, on South Africans, who this sort of thing was supposed to benefit, if you can link that to, for us to just this element of vested interests and trying to shape reform where it can benefit them.
I think what Professor Gumede touches on is the is the fact that if you are going to empower based on a characteristic that cannot change, then you create the perfect environment for this type of elite enrichment. If BEE was based on socioeconomic status, if it was sort of means tested, then you would get a situation where people would move through the production line. Once they've been lifted into the middle class, you would accept their middle class and they can no longer be the beneficiaries of this program. But that's the problem with the B in BEE, is it is based on a characteristic of economic participants that cannot change. So Professor Gumede is absolutely right to point to that re-enrichment cycle made possible by that unalterable characteristic for special economic dealings with the government and state. If we look at the ICT situation, where the Sunday Times reported that major telecommunication companies in South Africa were kicking back against Minister Malatsi's sort of move from BEE to equity equivalence, which is a move in the right direction away from BEE, but it still has some worrying undertones. But, credit where credit is due, it's a bold and sensible move. And if I listen to cabinet sources also on this issue, it's quite clear that there's a sectoral kickback or a sectoral pushback on this idea, and one understands why. BEE compliance costs and equity employment compliance costs are enormous, whether it's the race audits that must happen, whether it's the lawyers that must be hired, whether it's the labor experts and consultants, whether it's, the whole cottage industry of affirmative action in an economic race-based sense is one into which companies that are big enough can just include the cost of that as an overall sort of business, the cost of doing business. It's just an item on a bank statement or an item on a budget. For your smaller company, still trying to break into the market, they work against the economics of scale and the advantages that bring. They cannot necessarily compete at the level of these companies with the budget they have available to comply with race-based audits and tests and whatever the BE system and employment equity system requires. So on the one hand, you've got the sunk cost situation where these companies have spent years putting revenue into a system so that they can racially classify and audit their own staff. So you can understand that they wouldn't want to move away from that, because that would be an admission of billions spent unproductively. But at the same time, having these compliance costs foisted upon any competitor is useful for the big guys, because they can already bank it into their existing system. It is an advantage that keeps the smaller players out. Now, just like devalued assets in terms of land keep small farmers out, higher barriers to entry in terms of employment equity and race-based compliance, those costs become barriers that eat into the capital of small sector players who can or want to grow into big sector players. And that is sort of the cynical a realization that we need to come to, is that big business, people often accuse, if you're in favor of a free market, you're in favor of big business. No. Because a free market has competition at its heart, and big business has market dominance at its heart. I'm happy for big businesses to rise, but I'm also happy for big businesses to be able to fall when challenged. I mean, and this isn't a radical statement. We saw the horse-drawn carriage industry decimated by the internal combustion engine. It is what happens when technology and innovation takes us forward. But in a situation here where the telecommunication giants in South Africa put up barriers to entry, it gives the entire game away. It gives the game away that this isn't about economic growth. It isn't even about transformation. That's just a smokescreen. It is about ensuring market dominance. And that is ultimately the worst situation the consumer can be in. Because if the consumer cannot opt out from the big suppliers in a sector, then it is a de facto monopoly. And if there's anything in the competition thinking that is defiant of healthy consumer consideration, it is monopoly. So I think whether it's the mining charter, whether it's expropriation without compensation and big agri's weak position on that, whether it's the industry's defense of race-based ICT barriers, whether it is NHI and the sort of weird situation of companies like Discam and Discovery only really coming to the game of opposing NHI after, what, 10 years of being asked to get involved. The moment you start understanding that a free market is a threat not only to a behemoths state, but also a threat to entrenched business interests, you start to understand why the irrational, the thing that makes life more difficult for the consumer, often becomes policy, and often without a squeak of opposition from those entities that, in theory, at least should oppose them, i.e. big business.
I think South Africa is being afforded a unique opportunity globally and domestically in this moment in 2025, with some of the impetus energy being afforded by the Trump administration, but also now a year into the GNU. Of course, South Africa went to the polls on the 29th of May 2024, so over a year ago now. If reform attempts that were now being afforded for the first time in many years, if those are just used and that energy is used to benefit vested interests, I think we squander, I don't know, hyperbole, but a once in a century opportunity for real economic growth and improvement in living standards. So I think that's why we do this kind of work that we do, and when we highlight these policy and political risks. South Africa has very few of these opportunities come around every now and then.
We can look towards Namibia if we want the dangerous example of a corporatized growing economy. It's a growing economy, but the advantage actually doesn't filter beyond the useful cutouts, kickbacks, and carve-outs that the big corporates enjoy. Economic growth isn't something that's supposed to filter. The moment you have this trickle down or filter thing, it's nonsense. If we have a properly free market, it's from the bottom up. It is from the individual consumer looking at the market and having choice. And as long as we have big business working with the government to limit that choice, we are simply going to have this fantasy of trickle-down economics, but it's never actually going to mean anything to the people on the ground.
Very good note on which to end. So we will wrap up there. Thank you very much, Hermann, for all of your time, your insights with us today. For all of you who spent time with us this particular discussion, thank you very much. If you have not yet, just before the video ends, please remember to click on the like button and also become a subscriber of the CRA YouTube channel to get notifications of forthcoming videos, briefings, and other discussions. Until next time, this has been Chris Hattingh for the Center for Risk Analysis. Take care.